Hello, I'm Rick Marolt. I'm a member of the Alliance for Animals in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm inviting you to join a conversation between me and Rick Bogle here tonight. Rick has spent much of the last 8 years trying to reduce or eliminate experiments on primates around the country. He spent a number of years in California, and just recently he's moved back to Madison. And Rick, that's the first question I'd like to ask you about. I know there are national primate research centers around the country, but you've chosen to come back to Madison to do your work. Why is that?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. I think the most important reason is the fact that primate research in the United States, the way it's configured right now, is to some large degree a result of the earlier work and the efforts of Harry Harlow. And Harlow was a very well-known researcher who was here at the University of Wisconsin for so long. He trained many graduate students who themselves went out around the United States and in turn have educated other students. And so there's, to some degree, the University of Wisconsin almost is sort of, if you think about a disease model, it's almost the place that we would go back to maybe patient A or patient 1 or patient alpha or something like that. It's true that there was other primate vivisection that was going on to a small degree around the country even before Harlow, but Harlow's work was, even before most people are aware of, he was very well invested in it and had already begun to build a name for himself, and then became one of the founding, he was one of 3 authors of a document that was actually one of the founding documents that was used to basically start the entire National Primate Research Center system and endeavor by the United States government.
So the history of the National Primate Research Centers starts in Madison, or a big part of the history starts in Madison.
I think it's fair to say.
And is there also something unique, I've heard you talk about in the past, unique about the physical layout of the labs in Madison?
Yes. Of course, there's lots of labs around the country. Most of the large universities in the United States have some holding of non-human primates. The Wisconsin National Primate Research Center is one of the flagship facilities by the National Institutes of Health. There's 8 of those facilities, and the other 7 are much more secluded and difficult for the public to see. The Wisconsin Center is unique in the sense that you can actually walk up and look in the windows, see people working. You can walk up and touch the buildings. There's vent fans coming out of the basement of the Harlow lab. When they're on, you can smell the odor of the monkeys coming up out. It's much more personal. It's much more, there's something more palpable about being right. It's so intimate. Right. You stand between the primate center and the Harlow lab, and you're surrounded by about 2,000 monkeys right there. And this is the only place that I'm aware of in the United States that you have this opportunity for this experience. And I've been to labs all over the United States. I've been to at least 25 or 30 primate labs around the United States, and this is the one that has the strongest impact, offers the greatest opportunity to really understand what the industry is like.
And this is why you've tried to purchase some property near the labs. And I understand that's an illegal dispute right now. Let's come back to that a little bit later.
Sure.
Let's talk first more generally about the experiments in Madison. You've mentioned a couple labs. How many monkeys are involved in the experiments here?
On the University of Wisconsin campus, there's about 2,000 monkeys. There's about 700 or so, 800 or so in the Harlow building, the Harlow Primate Psychology Lab, and then the remainder are in a couple buildings that make up the Wisconsin Primate Center. Just on a side note, it's also important to note that even though there's 2,000 monkeys right here at the University of Wisconsin, the Covance has another 2,600 monkeys on hand at any one time out by the airport.
And Covance is a private business that does drug testing.
That's right, a private testing lab. And so Madison, for its small size, it has, comparatively for the rest of the country, it has a fairly large population of monkeys being used in biomedical research and drug testing.
So you've mentioned a couple labs at the University of Wisconsin, the Harry Harlow lab,
right,
and the National Primate Research Center. Where are these labs?
The Primate Center and the Harlow Lab are almost adjacent. They sit side by side, and they're between Orchard and Charter, right off Regent.
Okay.
And there's a small street that runs between Charter and Orchard that's called Capitol Court. Capitol Court's essentially a single block, and on both sides of Capitol Court are monkey labs.
Let's talk about typical experiments that happen on these monkeys. First, who does them? Who's doing this research?
Well, you and I pay for the research mostly. And I'm going to talk specifically about the University of Wisconsin because we really can't find out. There's not a good way for any member of the public to find out actually what goes on at Covance.
Okay.
It's a private facility. But we have pretty good information about what goes on at the University of Wisconsin. And so to start with, you and I pay for it. Who's doing the research? It's the people who are paid to do the research are usually professors, assistant professors, professional scientists at the Harlow Lab, at the Primate Center, and even other academic areas around campus, the medical school, the Department of Psychology. But the monkeys that they use will be housed or bred or experimented on at the Primate Center or the Harlow Lab. The researchers themselves, say the professor whose name is on the grant to do the research, actually may not be doing the actual experiments themselves.
Oh.
They might be having lab technicians do those things. Often what happens is there will be some sort of injections or serial blood draws from the monkeys, and the people that are doing that are way, way down the ladder of authority. Oftentimes the people that are actually doing supposedly the scientists you think of as doing the research themselves, they might not even see the animals that are being used. They're looking at blood samples or tissue samples or something like that. As far as what are the common kinds of research, every one of the researchers has something a little bit different. And it ranges a very broad gamut. Most of it is what we would call basic research. There's not very much research that specifically addresses the search, say, for a cure for cancer or something like that, or
Okay.
a prevention. I'm sorry, go
So
ahead.
now the distinction we're making is between basic research, basic science, and
Applied research or clinical research or something that is very targeted towards a specific sort of problem.
okay. And most what happens at the university on the monkeys is basic science.
It's primarily basic science, trying to understand the biology of monkeys. The belief is that what they learn about monkeys will be directly applicable to humans. The claim is that monkeys are so much like us that they're going to be good models of human biology, psychology, physiology, chemistry, all of those sorts of things.
Okay.
So we'll go through a short list of some of the sorts of research that's going on. I don't know if we should go alphabetically or just sort of randomly. So we'll just jump in. The director of the Harlow Lab is a man named Chris Coe. Chris Coe studies the short-term and long-term effects of stress the effects of stress on a mother on their offspring. In other words, it's a little confusing, but in other words, what he does is he takes a pregnant mother monkey, he stresses her in some way. In some of his studies, what he does is he puts them in a small cage, carries them into a dark room, and honks a horn at them. And he does this periodically through their pregnancy. And then once the baby is born, then at certain times in their life, he'll challenge them with some sort of a disease, usually a non-fatal disease, and then compare the rate or their ability to fend off the infection. How does their immune system, does it work as well as a monkey whose mother wasn't frightened during her pregnancy? So that's the work that's being done by the director of the Harlow Lab.
And is this the kind of study that a researcher might get a grant for, say, 1 year and do, or do some studies last longer?
They can run everything from a single year, depending on the researcher, all the way up to, I've seen them over 20 years long, where the same research will be going on for a long period of time. Another person at the Harlow Lab is Mary Schneider, who's doing the effects of alcohol exposure to fetuses. Did you know that if a pregnant mother drinks alcohol, that it could have an effect on her baby?
I can recall hearing that a few times.
You
yeah.
probably did. I think my 6th grade students when I was teaching school all knew that. Anyway, apparently the researchers at Wisconsin don't.
So she's been studying
I don't know, her grant is
alcohol
something
in
like
monkey
18
fetuses?
years old or
18
something like that.
years.
Something like that. I could be off. Maybe it's 14 years, but it's well over a decade.
And Chris Coase, do you happen to know how long that study's been going on?
Well, he's had a number of studies. Of course, he's the director of the Harlow Lab, and he's had those sorts of studies going on for an awfully long time.
Okay.
And I can't give you an actual number
Okay.
as far as that. Other sorts of studies that are going on, David Abbott is, he claims to be studying a disease called polycystic ovarian syndrome in women. Nobody knows the cause of polycystic ovarian syndrome. It's PCOS, is the acronym, or the initials of the disorder. And apparently in human females, when they have this disease, there's problems with their ovulation. They have excess hair on their face. It's a hormonal problem. And so what he's discovered is that if he treats pregnant monkeys with high levels or increased levels, higher than normal levels of testosterone, a male hormone, that when the babies are born, when the female babies are born, that they have higher, their characteristics seem to be more male-like. And in extreme cases, it causes their sort of gross deformities of their genitalia. Sometimes their vaginal openings can completely be closed, and there's all sorts of other apparently associated problems once the babies are born as well. He claims that the Primate Center claims that they've discovered the cause of PCOS, but if you look at the National Institutes of Health's websites, they say, still today, they say, we don't know the cause of PCOS.
Well, scaring pregnant monkeys is one thing, but what you just described sounds particularly horrific to me. Gross deformities, anatomical deformities. It seems clear that this researcher is creating these deformities through a pretty unnatural means, something that wouldn't happen in human beings. Large doses of testosterone injected into a fetus.
And I'm not sure if it's directly injected into the fetus. I think it's just they're exposed to testosterone in utero. So I think that perhaps what's happening is that the mother monkeys are being injected with large doses of testosterone.
What's the logic behind doing that? He's trying to study a human disease by creating symptoms in a monkey through hormone injections. Right,
and it's a common thing to do in all the entire industry of animal models. What researchers try to do is they try to find something that they can do to an animal, in this case monkeys, that when they inject this chemical into them, if they damage this part of the brain, or if they tie off this nerve or something, that the symptomology, that the way the monkeys seem to behave after the fact, after they've had these interventions, that it mimics to some degree some characteristics of a human illness.
In other words, it's more important to recreate the symptoms than cause them by the same mechanism that they'd be caused by in humans. Is that what I'm understanding?
Pretty much. Here's an example. There's a common monkey model that's used throughout the United States in Parkinson's disease research, and it's called the MPTP monkey model. It's the Parkinsonian monkey. And what they've discovered, this chemical, whose chemical name I don't, it's MPTP. Okay. They inject monkeys with this chronically. Every day give them an injection or 2 injections or something like that. And over time they develop the symptoms that we think of as being typical for Parkinson's disease. People will have tremors, they won't be able to move very easily, and then they'll use that as a model, and then they'll try to treat those symptoms.
But do the monkeys actually have Parkinson's?
Actually what they have is they're suffering an effect from this chemical, and in fact if we stop giving them this chemical, they recover.
I see. So it's really not at all like Parkinson's? No,
in Parkinson's disease, apparently there's a part of the brain called the substantia nigra that dies off and it quits producing dopamine, and that they think that neurotransmitter is what causes or it's related to the symptoms of Parkinson's disease in humans. So, it would essentially be like tying your leg up and letting your leg shrivel from lack of use, and then untying it and claiming that now I've created a model of polio. So, and I guess if you could somehow, figure out a way to instantly cure that shriveled leg, maybe it would have an effect on polio, but probably the causes are so different, it's just
Okay.
It's just totally different.
All right, you mentioned earlier that you and I are paying for these experiments.
Yeah.
What's the funding mechanism? How is it that we're paying for them?
Well, almost all of the funding for the primate centers and for primate research around the country at the university level comes from the National Institutes of Health. The National Institutes of Health is, of course, a gargantuan federal agency, and inside, under the umbrella of the National Institutes of Health, there's something like 27 other sub-agencies, like it's the National Eye Institute, the National Cancer Institute, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. There's all of these different things. And what they do is they're the ones that when a researcher decides that he wants to study, say, he wants to study the effects of caloric restriction, like the director of the Wisconsin Primate Center is doing. He's taking monkeys and he's feeding them about 70% of their normal amount that they would eat, and then trying to decide whether if you don't eat very much, will you be less ill or live longer or something. So he writes up a proposal, he sends that in, and whatever agency that he has sent that to, they'll look at it. A study group will look at that, 3 or 4 or 5, actually sometimes a fairly large number of people will look at that grant and decide whether, in their opinion, it's meritorious, whether is it an appropriate way to spend taxpayer dollars. Should we spend money on Joe Chemnitz's, the director's research on caloric restriction? Okay. Well, it sounds like it ought to be a fair way. And I suppose if it was clinical doctors that treat you and me, that were like, if we only knew this little bit of the puzzle, we could then find cures, maybe that would be sort of fair. You would at least could make the argument that it was being fairly vetted as they looked at those research grant proposals. But in fact, what happens is the people that are making those decisions are frequently people that are involved in the same line of research.
And again, more basic science, research.
Here's an example. Ned Kalin at the Primate Center, he studies the effects of fear in baby monkeys. He frightens baby monkeys. And, he's like the rest of them, I think he's nuts. But anyway, he's also he advises the National Institutes of Mental Health, another NIH, another branch of the NIH, on what sort of research should be funded. So when somebody writes up a research, a grant request and sends it into the National Institutes of Mental Health, one of the people that could be reading that and making a decision about whether that research looks like it's important could be Ned Kalin. Yeah, the guy who thinks that frightening baby monkeys is the way we ought to spend our tax dollars.
Right. So if the money is coming from the National Institutes of Health, let's put this in real simple terms. These are federal tax dollars that Congress appropriates, gives to the NIH, National Institutes of Health. And then there are groups, committees of people who are engaged in similar research or have been, who are naturally sympathetic to the requests for money.
That's right.
Who then review them for merit.
That's right.
Okay.
That's
and
right.
then money gets sent out. Do you know how much money comes into Wisconsin that way?
Oh no, overall I sure don't, because it's going to be, boy, into Wisconsin is hard to say, because that's going to include everything from the National Institutes of Health.
Or at the university on primate research?
I think the base grant recently was for the Primate Center itself. The base grant, this is the grant that's going to pay to keep the lights on and things like that. I think it was $9 million, but I think overall it's, and I think it's around $50 million.
Okay. Good.
Annually.
Good. So that's some of the basic facts about the research and what kind of experiments are going on. Thanks for all that information.
Sure.
I want to ask you now a little more personally, why are you so against experiments on monkeys? Why have you made this
my life's work?
Your life's work, essentially, for the last 8 years or more. You're obviously very serious about this.
Right.
Why? I mean, it's easy to think these are not humans. These are monkeys, and there's got to be some benefits of the research on them. If nothing else, then we at least learn more about monkeys. Why is it such a big deal to you, Rick?
Yeah, why is it? I was a 6th grade school teacher, and my kids used to ask me. We studied all sorts of things. We did world history in 6th grade in Oregon, where I taught. And so we basically did a survey of what's happened in human society over time. And when we talked about things like slavery and the Holocaust and the Cambodian killing fields and all those sorts of things, one of the things my students always asked me was, why do people let things like that go on? They simply couldn't imagine in their mind that something in their community, that somebody would start, say, rounding up children and doing some horrific thing to them, and then 50 years down the road we'd be writing about it in a history book and saying, wasn't that horrible?
Sixth graders can be pretty smart, huh?
They're pretty smart. And so, you know, I didn't have an answer for them. Why did people do things like that? But we all, every year, we all came to sort of the same conclusion that if we were living in those times, that we would have wanted to have been one of the people who hid somebody in our basement or helped somebody get away to freedom. Of course, so I guess that's, to some degree, that's my part of my motivation for thinking that, because my kids, I think they expect, my students would have expected that if I was telling the truth and I wasn't blowing smoke, that in fact, if I was telling them that people should have stood up and they should have said, this can't go on, that if we're not going to do it now, if we think that the situation is similar, that if we don't do it now, we wouldn't have done it then. And I certainly don't want to believe that of myself. I want to believe that I would have been one of those people.
So it's important for you to stand up. But
So,
implicitly, you're experimenting on monkeys with some other
right.
very important social issues.
I'd say that the comparisons are not even implicit, but I think they're explicit. And I think that the research that's come out of the labs, that's come out of an awful lot of field observation, but especially the controlled sorts of carefully documented studies that even people like Kalin and Coe and Chemnitz have done actually in their laboratories. They've made overt claims, which I actually agree with, that that there's very meaningful cognitive and emotional similarities between monkeys and us. That's why they think that experimenting on the brain of a monkey is going to tell us something about our own brains, about our own emotions and our own mental processes, because they're so similar.
And when you say cognitive, you're talking about
thinking
processes.
Yeah,
you're saying that in essence that monkeys think something like how humans think.
As far as we can tell, they think a lot like humans. And when we ask monkeys in a lab to order things, to group things, to put like things in like piles and different things in different piles, they do it the same way you or I would do it. It doesn't look very different. As they do the most simple, monkeys aren't as smart as we are. There's no, I mean, we're geniuses in the entire animal kingdom. There's no question. We're super geniuses. But on a very fundamental level, the laboratory research has shown that monkeys are able to do very basic arithmetic things. They can add, they can subtract, they can count up to certain numbers. They understand, they'll play joystick games where they're moving something around on a screen and not winning anything except winning against another monkey. We know that they'll do all sorts of amazing things. Here at the Wisconsin Primate Center, there used to be a group of monkeys that they owned out at the Henry Vilas Zoo. And those monkeys, there were 3 colonies of macaques there, and those were the most observed 3 colonies of macaques in the world. They were the most written about, the most documented. There was somebody there almost every day taking notes on the social interactions of the animals. So there's just tons of information from them. One particular story I like a lot that was Franz de Waal wrote about in his book, Peacemaking Among Primates. There's a story of, these were stump-tailed macaques, and there's the dominant male in the stump-tail colonies don't want the subordinate males to mate with he doesn't want them to have sex with the other females.
Right.
And in this one situation, this older female apparently fell in love with this younger male. And they would go in the evening, about sunset, they all went inside to the inner part of the monkey house. And then at some point, she'd sneak out, and a little bit later, they wouldn't go out together, a little bit later the male would come out, and then they would have sex. And he would get very excited as he was mounting her, and he'd start to yell. And she'd turn around and put her hand over his mouth. So, be quiet because the big monkey's going to come in and break us up.
So you're saying their thought processes, while they're not as, monkeys aren't as intelligent as humans, their thought processes are still similar.
They're so similar that we seem to understand, we seem to reason in a similar way.
Okay, so maybe the differences are more a matter of
Degree.
degree than kind.
Yeah, degree than
Quantity
kind.
than quality. And you're also making a statement about the social relationships with the story you just told about the violet seal monkeys. And
Right.
their social relationships, or their male-female relationships,
Right.
are similar to humans. I think the story you told
Right.
may
Well,
have some human analogs.
Sure.
And you also mentioned earlier the emotions of monkeys. Now, when I was in school, I was in 6th grade, in high school and college,
Right.
I think it was still a fairly radical concept. Do animals think? Do animals have feelings? And I'm hearing from you that the researchers themselves are talking about thought processes in monkeys, and about emotions also.
You know, isn't it crazy that you went through school, I'm sure you went through a good school system, and basically you came out with this idea that animals don't have emotions. And yet in 1958, Harlow published the Nature of Love, talking about the love that a mother monkey and a baby monkey have for each other, and the need for that emotional interaction.
Yeah, I know that now.
And you know that now, but in fact, that information's been out there, and somehow, for some reason, there's some sort of, and I don't understand why, but and I think it's disappearing. You know, I think things like Animal Planet and Nature Channel and all those sorts of animal shows on TV, the more that they talk about the way animals behave in the wild, the more observational studies we have, we see them behaving in ways that everybody can relate to. And of course, as we would expect, if there's anything right about evolution, we would expect that the animals that are the closest to us in evolutionary time would have characteristics that were more like us than animals that were more distant.
Sure.
And so it makes sense that as we watch chimpanzees or bonobos or gorillas interact, or monkeys, that we would find behaviors that are more similar to our own behaviors than if we, say, watch, I don't know, lobsters or something like that. There's a lot of studies. There's so many studies that have over time that have pointed out the strength of character, I guess you would call it, in monkeys.
Well, that reminds me of one particular experiment I want to ask you about, because I've heard you talk about it.
Sure.
Something about altruism in monkeys?
Sure. Masterman, Jules Masterman, in, I think it was about 1963. It could be, I might have the date off a little bit here, but it's pretty close. Maybe it was 68. He and two colleagues, they, I don't know why they did this. It wasn't explained in the paper. But what they did was they trained monkeys to pull a series of chains depending on which light was on. They were in a box, and a light comes on, and you pull the chain this way, or the other light comes on, and you pull these two chains or something, and you get a reward. You get a food pellet.
Okay.
All right. And then what they did was they built this device. They probably already had it built, but there were two boxes, and you put a monkey on one side of the box and a monkey on the other, and there's a wall between them. And one of the monkeys can see the other monkey, but the other monkey can't see back. And so now the monkey that can, the monkey that's sort of in control, that can see the other monkey through the one-way glass, is the lights come on, and it pulls the handles, the chains in the right manner.
Right,
to
get food.
They get food.
Right.
That's its only way it's going to get food.
Okay.
They're not feeding it. Now the monkey knows what he can do to earn food. He has to work for his food. So this time, pulls the chains, the food comes out, but the monkey in the box next to him receives an electrical shock. A pretty powerful electrical shock, apparently. Enough to make the monkey in the other box kind of jump around and scream. So I don't know how many times the monkeys had to pull the chains in order before they put sort of two and two together, that I'm the one that's shocking the monkey in the other cage, that's causing the shock. But once the monkeys learned that, many of them quit pulling the chains, and many of them went for days without eating. Then the most extreme case, one of the monkeys went 12 days with, just refused to eat for 12 days.
Because the only way that monkey could have gotten food was to pull a chain that would have given an electrical shock to another monkey.
And he
12 days.
12 days without eating. I don't know very many people that have, even if they wanted to decide I'm going to go on a long fast or something, have gone 12 days. That's a long time to go without
how do
eating.
the researchers explain this?
Well, they don't really have a way, except that they're saying that it looks like altruistic behavior, that somehow the monkeys, it reminds me so much of the sorts of things that went on in the labs in Germany. They would take a mother and a child and do things to them, and then write and remark on how long they could withstand this punishment before, those sorts of things. The bottom line is that, to me, anybody looking at that study should be able to say, uh-oh, we've discovered somebody else, another species living on the planet that seems to understand the golden rule, seems to see things in an ethical sense, even if they may not be able to explain to you in the same sort of, highbrow, convoluted way that you and I might converse with each other. Something's going on. The monkeys understood and made a decision. And those hunger pains aren't just every moment.
Right,
I mean, now
right.
in an hour from now I have to make the decision. This is 12 days of just, and I don't know what happened at the end. I don't know if they gave up, or I don't know. The paper didn't go. The paper's only just a page and a half anyway.
So in other words, the researchers are inviting the monkeys to hurt each other.
That's right.
And the monkeys are demonstrating perhaps a higher ethical standard and refusing to hurt each other, even if it deprives themselves of food.
Now I think this is the sort of thing that really bothers me, is that you shouldn't be expected to know about that study. The average mom and pop at home that's writing their tax, their check to the federal government, shouldn't be expected to know about that study. But Chris Coe, Ned Kalin, Joe Chemnitz, Mary
All the
Schneider,
researchers.
everybody that uses monkeys and makes the claim that I'm using them because their minds are so similar to ours, because their emotions are so similar, because the way their children develop over time, mentally and cognitively, emotionally and socially, is so much like the way we do. At what point, how like us need they be? How similar to us do we have to demonstrate that they are before what they're doing to them isn't any different from what we're doing?
And now, have we come around to the short answer to my question of why this is so important to you, or why you are so against experiments on monkeys?
If this was being done to children, I'd be trying to do the same thing. I'd be trying to call the public's attention to it and making it stop.
Because you see a great similarity between monkeys and
there is a great
people.
similarity.
Okay.
It's not that I see the great similarity. In fact, I think that the people using the animals, in fact, themselves say there's a great similarity, but we can do these things to them because they have no rights in our society. We see them the same way that we used to perceive people of color, or people who had developmentally who were disabled, or any difference that we've in the past been able to say, I can buy and sell you because you don't look like I do.
Right.
And that's not much different than what's going on today.
And the research continues, and it's defended, and
It's increasing.
increasing even. And we hear defenses of the experiments frequently, and I'd like you to respond to some of those. For example, we hear frequently that all major medical advances that have benefited human health have relied on animal research. And animal research is necessary to help us progress and ultimately cure human diseases such as cancer and AIDS. That's true, isn't it?
Well, I guess it's the short answer is no. But let's back up just a second and say, there's two things. First, we can make an argument that in fact it isn't true. But before we even do that, let's assume, for the sake of just this one side of the argument, let's say it is true. Let's say that in fact every single medical breakthrough that we've had has been a direct result of experimenting on monkeys.
Okay.
Let's say that.
That's it.
Right. So is then, given what we've learned through all of these experiments about the similarity between us, is it still okay to use them? What if every medical breakthrough that we've had turns out it came from 12-year-old Catholic girls that we used to experiment on. Would we now argue that we should keep doing that because every breakthrough's come from that?
So you're saying, in other words, even if it is beneficial or could be beneficial, it wouldn't be ethical.
That we've learned enough. We've learned that they're so similar to us that it's unethical. But wait, fortunately, we're not left with that. We're not left with that seemingly difficult decision that we have to make because, in fact, there hasn't been very much come out of animal research. Now, it is true that if we go way, way back in time, that before we knew what a heart did, before we knew what your stomach did, that in fact we probably did learn things from experimenting on animals, or at least butchering animals, and seeing dead people, and we're able to make some comparisons and say, you know, it looks like, I always hear, don't you believe that people a long time ago, before there was any science at all, don't you think that every person that butchered an animal recognized that the stomach is where the food went when they ate it?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course,
Yeah.
Because they're cutting it open and they're looking, they're like, oh, look, there's the last thing they ate.
Sure.
So we certainly could learn something by studying animals. And so if a person died and they looked in, they're like, oh, look, it's the stomach. I bet it's the same as the deer we just killed. And so certainly on a very gross sort of anatomical level, yes, we could make discoveries about ourselves. Assuming, of course, there's this story that Galen, one of the, it was a doctor during the gladiator days in ancient Rome. He's one of the people that supposedly is one of the fathers of vivisection. And they said that there's this claim that he learned an awful lot about physiology by dissecting. Then they are not sure because it's Roman times and what they're writing. It was probably a Barbary macaque, a type of a monkey. Some people think that some of the animals he was dissecting may have been chimpanzees because they were bringing so many animals out of Africa at the time for the games. Now, of course, he's also the doctor during the gladiator times, and so they're dragging these humans that have been chopped up and eaten by lions and ripped apart. So he's seeing, I guess, hundreds and hundreds of cadavers of even living people that aren't quite dead,
yeah.
And watching blood pump out of their arteries, and they've been eviscerated. And so it's easy to claim that he's learning his stuff only through animal studies. But I mean, the fact is they're throwing Christians into the arena to be eaten and killed and butchered up. So I don't know why we have to assume that he wasn't also on the side cutting Christians up.
Okay.
Who knows?
So we're talking about basic anatomical comparisons.
Absolutely,
Learning
yeah.
something about people by looking at
Okay, here's
animals.
one, polio.
But I just wanted to
What
say that
about
because I
polio?
heard just recently, I actually heard a primate veterinarian say that the cure for polio relied on animal research.
Right. Well,
isn't that a clear example of a benefit from animal research?
You know, my guess is that everybody that studied polio ate dinner with a knife and a fork. It's not clear to me that the fork was absolutely needed in order to cure polio or to find a prevention for polio. And it is true that many of them used monkeys. We don't know how many were used. The best estimates are something in the neighborhood of 5-6 million monkeys were used during the years that we were actually trying to find out about polio. The reason that we used monkeys, though, we weren't using them necessarily as a model of polio. The problem with it is that we couldn't keep the polio virus alive. And so what we were doing was we continually infected monkeys with polio so that we could have polio to use in our actual experiments where we were trying to come up with a vaccine or something like that.
So the monkeys were the petri dish.
The monkeys,
keeping the
sort of, yes,
the disease
they were.
alive.
That's right. They were like an incubator. But it's the problem with that is that early on it was discovered that if you took a monkey with polio and you ground up its brain, you turned its brain into basically sort of a liquid, and then you injected that liquid into another monkey's nasal passage, that in fact that second monkey would get polio. This led researchers to believe that polio was transmitted through the nose, that you somehow breathed in the polio virus.
And did they actually do what you just described? They ground up brains?
We used 6, 7, 8, nobody knows the exact number, but millions of. In fact, India stopped exporting monkeys to the United States because they almost went rhesus monkeys because they almost went extinct. We almost took all of the rhesus monkeys out of India and used in this form of research, and some giant share of them were being used to grow more polio in their brain so that it could be shoved up the nose of other monkeys. What happened though was that earlier on, researchers studying humans had made the discovery that that polio seemed to be an orally transmitted thing. That in fact you got it on your hands, you ate something that had the virus, it went into your stomach, it grew in the gut, and that's how then it was. But that information was essentially ignored because they had good evidence that in fact by injecting this stuff up to the pulverized, the homogenized brain up through the nose of the other monkeys would give them polio, and it did. It did. But it's worse. Wait. So to try to do something about that, they invented all of these different sort of chemicals that you could put inside a child's nose that might guard them against the polio vaccine. So literally thousands of children lost their sense of smell because they were treated with this stuff to try to stop them from getting polio. This is early on. The Nobel Prize for polio research was given not for any of the monkey research, but because they finally learned how to grow polio in a petri dish. And once they grew polio in a petri dish, then they could all have the sort of the same sort of basic virus to study, and that was considered actually the breakthrough that led directly to a polio vaccine.
So to summarize, the approach that the researchers were taking with monkeys was not fruitful and in fact delayed.
One of the developers of one of the vaccines said before Congress that the use of monkeys in development of the polio vaccine probably delayed the vaccine for a generation.
And also caused children to lose their sense of smell because
children,
all the chemicals that were being put into the noses.
And you also have to ask yourself, because of the money and the effort that went into all of this monkey modeling stuff, did it delay the development of the petri dish? Did it delay the development of actually looking at the human data and understanding that it was a gastro sort of, did it delay that? We know in some cases that in other areas, cigarette smoking is a pretty good example. The tobacco, and everybody knows this, the tobacco industry used animal data for at least a generation to demonstrate that cigarette tobacco smoke doesn't cause lung cancer, because you can't give lung cancer to dogs. They were using dogs. They had dogs hooked up to these machines where they were breathing cigarette smoke around the clock for days, months, weeks, years, long time, and they wouldn't get lung cancer. So based on that data, we continued to keep cigarettes on the market.
So in other words, in at least a couple cases that you've cited, relying on animal research to tell us something about human health has been counterproductive.
Could be deadly.
And even deadly. Let's move along then. I want to ask you to respond to another statement that we hear frequently about animal research, and that is that there's a lot of regulations, federal level, state level, God knows where. There's a lot of regulations and there's oversight at every level. And I've seen statements that come out of the labs in Madison telling me that the animals are treated very well, very humanely. All the regulations are followed closely, and we really don't need to worry about the monkeys. So how come you're still worried, Rick?
Well, the main regulation is that covers covers a tiny bit of animal research in the United States. It's called the Animal Welfare Act. So let me just qualify my tiny bit. The Animal Welfare Act only covers the covered species. It doesn't cover rats or mice or invertebrates or fish. It doesn't cover any of those things. We know that, we don't know the exact number. We think there's about 100 million mice used in research a year.
Jeez.
We don't know the exact number of rats. Rats and mice aren't counted by anybody. There's no way to know, but there's some pretty good ways that we can estimate, and we think probably about 100 million mice are used a year. Those animals are simply not even considered by any regulatory body. So the Animal Welfare Act covers all the other animals. It covers dogs, cats, rabbits, and monkeys, and some other things as well. So this is the way it works. The keystone of the Animal Welfare Act is a on-campus or in the facility, if it's not a university, a committee called the Animal Care and Use Committee. And they're supposed to oversee all of the animal research that occurs on campus. We'll use the University of Wisconsin for an example.
Okay.
They're the ones that are supposed to ascertain and to verify that the research that's going on campus is in compliance with the Animal Welfare Act. The Animal Welfare Act says that if you're going to do things that are painful to animals, as long as it doesn't interfere with the research, then you have to do something about their pain and suffering. You have to give them anesthesia or analgesia as long as it doesn't interfere with the research. If you're doing something that it would interfere with, then you don't have to do that. You can, anything that the IACUC says you can do, essentially you can do. Now, here at the University of Wisconsin, here's just one. I can give you a couple examples of why we think the oversight doesn't work. Federal inspectors came in. Now remember that the keystone of this is the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee.
These are the oversight committees actually on campus.
Actually on campus, made up of researchers on campus. Okay. There's most of the people that make up the committee are themselves animal researchers. Almost all. I think there's one person on the committee, or perhaps two people on the committee who's not, but it's a 12-person committee or something, and there's two. Anyway, almost all of them are animal researchers, and they're looking over each other's shoulder, making sure that they follow the law. Okay, so annually, supposedly annually, sometimes it gets stretched out a little bit more, but the United States Department of Agriculture comes in and inspects facilities that are covered under the Animal Welfare Act. Mm-hmm. Well, they came into the University of Wisconsin, and these outside investigators came in and were here for like a day or two. And one of the things that they discovered was an elderly monkey used in a researcher's experiments here. The researcher's name is A. Terasawa, a woman from Japan, a senior researcher at the Primate Center. She was doing these studies. She straps monkeys into chairs, and then she puts two small tubes down through the top of their head into the very deep parts of their brain, and uses a pump to push chemicals in, and then another pump to suck little pieces of the results out. It's called a push-pull perfusion. And the vets who had been looking at the monkeys that used in this way were saying that all of the monkeys seemed to be like something was wrong with them. I'm not surprised. Anyway, the inspectors came in and they discovered that one of the monkeys that was in the chair, this was a very elderly monkey, died while she was in the chair because the technician, remember I told you most of the research is done by a technician. Yeah. The technician who was supposed to be there monitoring the experiment as it was taking place, he took a lunch break and left this elderly monkey in this chair with these pumps pushing in and sucking out this whatever it was.
And then what happened?
And then what happened? Well, they wrote up their report. They said that the university was out of compliance with the act. The IACUC said, "Oh my gosh, we'll suspend this study," and then they published.
This is just because the technician went to lunch?
Yes, and the monkey died.
Oh, and the monkey died.
And the monkey died, and then when it was made public, in fact, it hadn't been made public. We had filed an open records request, and we learned about this through documents that the university gave us. We made it public. After we made it public, the oversight committee then says, we're going to suspend Dr. Terasawa's research for 2 years. She won't be allowed to work on animals for 2 years. And this is an example that, in fact, that the oversight system works. Now, that sounds well and good, except that Terasawa's studies have been going on for 17 years.
17 years.
17 years. In some cases, the monkeys had been chaired for days on end.
So the study goes on for 17 years. A monkey dies after a attendant, a technician.
We don't know how many monkeys, of course, have died in the past. The attendant went to lunch. In this particular case, though, federal inspectors happened to be around, and they somehow discovered this.
I see. So the oversight committees that you described on campus didn't discover it or didn't take action. No. And federal regulators discovered, federal inspectors.
And it was only when they became frightened that the federal oversight, the federal regulators might somehow fine them or embarrass them in public or something that they actually took action.
Then they came forward.
That's right. We just got, just one more case. We recently got The director of the Wisconsin Primate Center, the Wisconsin National Primate Research Center here, Joe Kimnitz, has said that all of the facilities operate in the same way.
All eight of them.
There were actually 7 when he said that, but we recently we made a we made a public records request to Yerkes, one of the 8 centers in Atlanta associated with Emory University. We requested documents from there, APHIS, USDA inspection reports, just like the ones we got from here and found out about Tarasawa's monkeys.
USDA is the United States Department of Agriculture.
That's right. They're the ones who are supposed to enforce the Animal Welfare Act.
All right.
So we get these records. They're 2 years old by the time we get them. So that's how current our knowledge is about this, because the institutions are just absolutely against anybody actually learning what's going on. So we get these records, and we find out that about 80% of the monkeys at Yerkes now are individually housed, which means that they're socially isolated, and they appear to be going nuts.
And these are very social animals, am I right?
These are animals that are highly social, of course, that are spending much of their time actually in physical contact with each other, grooming, just touching each other. And so we're keeping them now for decades on end in these individual little boxes. And about 80% of the monkeys there at most of the individually housed monkeys at Yerkes are essentially nude. They have no hair left on their body because they've pulled it all out themselves, because they have nothing to do. So they're constantly picking at themselves. And we know that most of the monkeys, or many of the monkeys that are individually housed, they'll go nuts. Some of them will develop such severe psychotic sort of reactions to being kept in isolation for decades. They'll end up biting the ends of their fingers off. They'll chew holes in their arms. They'll bite off the ends of their tails. It's called self-injurious behavior. It's a real problem in the labs.
They're neurotic.
They're absolutely neurotic. They try to treat it with drugs. So in some cases, it's so bad that they'll just kill the animals because they're so wounded.
And I imagine the monkeys don't make as good subjects of a study if they're neurotic and demonstrating this kind of dysfunctional behavior, do they?
Well, if 80% of Yerkes monkeys are in this situation, those are the monkeys they're using in the experiments. You often hear the claim by the people who defend this and say that it's tightly regulated and that the researchers must care about their animals because, as you just suggested, that maybe a neurotic monkey, a monkey who's wounding itself, something's wrong with it just mentally, wouldn't be a very good research subject. But if you're doing basic research on the physiology of their eye, if you're doing something to try to create some sort of model of glaucoma, if you're doing something about, you want to know if I inject a pregnant monkey with testosterone, what's the results? You may not care.
Yeah.
You may just not give a damn.
Okay. So you've given us a couple examples of apparent failures of oversight or regulation. Along the way, you mentioned getting information about the experiments, and sometimes you've had to wait 2 years.
In some cases, even longer. We have outstanding requests for documents and videos that we know they're there. They say that they have, that they just refuse to give us.
They just refuse?
Just refuse.
So it's difficult to get information to find out what's happening with experiments that, as you said at the beginning, you and I have paid for.
That's right. That's right. Now, what they'll tell you is we publish the results of our work. So after the fact, you can go and find out sort of what they did by looking at their report that comes out in a scientific journal.
Right.
We should be able to go to these IACUC committee meetings.
The IACUCs are the
oversight committees that are supposed to listen and approve the research that's going to occur. We should be able to go, these are supposedly open meetings,
right,
and in many states they are. We should be able to go sit and listen about the proposed experiments and then have an opportunity to comment on those. We think that that's too cruel. We think that the monkeys would suffer too much. We can't see the medical value in that or something.
Right.
And maybe they could discount our criticisms, but at least we could be talking about what's going to occur. Right now we're in the situation we can only talk about what's already been done. And whenever we find some sort of problem, whenever we find that the oversight wasn't good or the monkeys weren't given, whatever the case, any problem that we find, every time what they tell us is, well, we've fixed that problem now.
So why can't you attend these committee meetings?
Well, they'll have the police come and drag you out.
Seriously?
Seriously.
Wow.
So there's a part of the committee meeting that's open, that you can go and you can sit and listen to them like approve the minutes of the last committee, or thank John for coming and talk about a training session that's coming up. But then when they're going to talk about the actual protocols, the experiments that they're going to approve that are going to be performed, then you have to leave the room. You're not allowed to hear what they're going to do to the animals.
So one good way of finding out about the experiments before they happen has been denied to you, and you have to rely on articles published after the experiments.
As far as I know, it's the only way to find out what's going to happen.
Requests that may take 2 years or more to be filled.
That's right.
So
and then often when we get them, it's interesting too, is that there'll be pages and pages of just blacked out information.
Redacted.
Redacted. They just don't, it's been censored. You're not allowed to know this.
I see.
Yeah.
So you obviously face some obstacles.
Yeah.
In what you're trying to do to reduce or even stop experiments on monkeys. Experiments continue. The obstacles still exist.
Increasing.
How do you see the future? What happens to this cause? Do you see any hope for the monkeys?
Well, I mean, the reality is that there's more monkeys being used. The federal government is expending ever larger sums on breeding more monkeys around the country, trying to increase the number of monkeys that we're using. Right now in the United States, we think that the number is between about 50 and 100,000 that are used annually in the United States. We don't know for sure. There's no good records. The record keeping by the federal government on these issues it reminds me of Homeland Security. No wonder the terrorists can get in and do things in the country if they want, because apparently our federal officials, have hay stuck in their hairs. I don't know. On the other hand, is there any good news? Around the world, not surprisingly, there's countries that are a bit more progressive than the United States. We've seen some countries actually make sure that some chimpanzees, non-human primates, apes, gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees, bonobos, have been given some basic rights in some countries.
Really?
That's actually part of the Constitution now of New Zealand, that they can't be treated badly. We know that recently in some it was in I'm going to get this wrong, in Sweden, was it Norway? They just passed a law that took all apes, even down into gibbons and siamangs, off limits. They're not allowed to use those anymore. There's been a ban on the use of great apes, chimpanzees, in the United Kingdom for a number of years now. Austria, just passed an omnibus animal rights bill, so that they're still using animals, of course, and they're still using animals in every which way, but in ways that, just off the wall ahead of the United States. People really are beginning to recognize that the feelings, the emotions, there's somebody inside,
right?
And so there's some guarded cause for hope. Jane Goodall, not too many years ago, was very careful about what she said about research, and I think as she ages and becomes more concerned that there's not enough progress, she's speaking out very loudly now.
Jane Goodall is a famous scientist who studied primates and
chimpanzees at Gombe
in Africa.
And yeah, that's right. She's the one who discovered that, first wrote about the fact that chimpanzees use tools and all sorts of culture things. We now know that culture is transmitted in not only chimpanzees but monkeys as well. Just another way that shows that animals that are the most similar to us, in fact, are similar in surprising ways.
Yeah. I want to come back to New Zealand briefly. Here in the United States, if anybody talks about animal rights, they're considered fairly
wacko terrorists.
Way out there, wacko terrorists.
Yeah, that's right.
You're saying in New Zealand there's actually some constitutional right for certain species of non-human animals.
For the great apes.
For the great apes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So where you sit today, you see a difficult challenge, but also some cause for hope as you see other countries around the world getting ahead of the United States and recognizing animals as having someone inside.
Well, that's right. Discussions like this, we're going to have to force the issue. It should, if a university is about a place where people come together and discuss the issues of the time and are willing to, bravely winnow the wheat from the chaff and not be afraid to look at the facts straight ahead, you would think this is where this sort of discussion should be going on,
right.
But they're afraid to talk about it. So the conversation that you and I are having right now, efforts by activists around the country to try to create some sort of national debate. I have hope that something is going to come from that. I think that if nothing comes from that, if they continue to drag their feet in the, drag their heels and refuse to engage in discussion, refuse to even give a hint that there might be something to what we're talking about, then in that case the future doesn't look very bright. And I think that as more people learn about this, there's going to be an ever-increasing possibility that people are going to just decide to take matters into their own hands. And that would be unfortunate. We don't want that. I mean, who would want that? What we'd want is rational discussion, coming together as a people, making a decision that we think is ethical and moral and fact-based, and proceed from there and try to figure out all of the problems as we go instead of hide from the problem and continue to try to bilk the public out of millions of dollars.
As opposed to wanting to take matters into your own hands or encouraging other people to, what you really rather see right now is more openness from the university, more public discussion, more education of the public.
If we can talk about this, I think we'll make the right decision. I think that there's a good bit of, I think historically, that we've almost always made the right decisions if we can get the discussion out in the public. I think when we talked about segregation, when we talked about access for handicapped people, I think that we, as a society, if we can at least talk about it and get it as a part of our sort of larger cultural discussion that we have, we frequently do make the right decisions. We do make progress. And I think that the people that don't want change, don't want progress, they understand that, and it's in their interest to keep the discussion as quiet, to keep it as hidden, to keep the facts, to constantly spin the truth so that people really don't know what's going on. They don't want you to know. They don't want anybody listening to us to actually know what's going on. They want the public to hear it only that we're curing cancer. That's what they want them to hear, because then we'll be so afraid we don't want to know the truth.
Right. So let's keep the hope for more public discussion, more public education.
That's right.
This is one step in the process.
Yep.
It's very informative and helpful. Thank you very much for coming over and talking with us tonight.
My pleasure. Yeah.
Our guest was Rick Bogle. I'm Rick Marolt from the Alliance for Animals. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. We hope you found it informative and that perhaps you go and talk about it with people you know also. Thank you very much.
Thanks.